This is the opening session of the so-called 5 University Conference. Just a couple of words of background before we launch into the main event. The 5 Universities Conference is an annual meeting. This is the 10th such meeting. We've organized it between ourselves, Princeton University, University of Tokyo, Peking University of Petak, Korea University, and of course ourselves, the Lee Kuan Yew School. This choice of universities, of course, represents the best of academic thinking on the challenges that we're going to be discussing. But I think all of you will also notice that these 5 have been chosen to, in a way, represent different nations that are very much engaged with the development of certain global outcomes. This is the 10th such 5 university meeting. We meet every year in December at a different university. 10 years ago, the sequence began at Princeton. 5 years ago was the first time we organized it here in Singapore at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and this is obviously the 10th such year. This completes the second of the 5-year cycles. Now, each university sends a delegation of 5 or so academics to the meeting. We typically have one public session, the one that we're going to begin with, and then after this, we have a more closed academic set of discussions over the next 1.5 days. And then, not always, but typically, we end with a graduate student session, where graduate students from, PhD students from the different institutions are invited to present their work to a group of academics from all 5 of these universities. Now, the topic that these 5 universities deal with are obviously organized around the notion of international challenges. And that means, in the first instance, international relations, but it also brings in discussions of history, sociology, economics, plus others. And over the years, as the 5 universities meetings evolved, yet other people were brought into these meetings. My great friend and LSE colleague, Peter Trowitz, is here. He and I have been participating in these 5U meetings even before I joined the Lee Kuan Yew School when I was still at LSE, and a range of others as well, coming in and out as the topic and the occasion sees fit. So that's a little bit of the history. This time, we initially, organizers, initially thought we would do a session around Kishore Mahbubani's recent writings. Not least, his recent book, Has the West Lost It? Kishore, along with some of the others that you're going to get to meet over the next hour or so, has been the great driver of these 5U meetings. Kishore and the others have always thought that beyond simply meeting to talk about academic ideas, we helped foster a mutual understanding on the great challenges that the global economy and the global polity sees. So we thought that this year it would be nice, given that Kishore has decided to not join us, actually, well, actually not because of that, but you'll notice Kishore has not joined us. We thought that we would organize a session around Has the West Lost It? Now, on the assumption that he was going to join us, some people might think it unfair that all the other 4 delegations, plus 1 or 2 members of the Lee Kuan Yew School itself, would show up to gang up on Kishore. But we were sure that if we did, he would defend himself admirably. In the event, he decided not to show, and we miss him terribly. And we thought that if we went back to the initial idea, it would really be unfair to be criticizing Kishore's writings when he was not here. Kishore, has been one of the principal drivers of this 5U meeting, along with the other heads of the delegations. The success of these meetings stem from the charisma, the personality, the intellectual heft, the convening power of the different delegation heads. This year, Kishore decided to be no longer part of this 5U meetings. So, if this 10th year is the last 5U meeting, and it has run out of steam, you'll know why. despite the remaining convening power of the other heads of delegation. One other quick thing to report on this front, Professor Chia Ching-kuo from Beta has also been one of the intellectual drivers for 5U, and he too is stepping down as Dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University. I hope you will continue to come to these meetings, but if he, like Kishore, decides not to, well, that's just what we need, isn't it? What academics call the presence of confounding variables in trying to determine cause and effect on the success of the 5U gathering. Now, these 5U gatherings typically involve discussions of security, global governance, some on economics, trade, and globalization, quite naturally. So they cover the state of the global economy and polity. That brings us to the panel session this morning. As you have seen from the program, our public panel session this morning, after that history, is on prospects for denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, a very timely set of issues to get into. As an indication of the progress of our 5U meetings, I double-checked what we discussed last year. This year, we're discussing denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula. Last year, we discussed how to deal with the North Korean nuclear conundrum. Obviously, this is an area where we're making great strides and progress. Or alternatively, we've simply, as academics, chosen enduring, sustained challenges on which to discuss. So I will, in a second, invite the speakers to come up and join me on the panel. But to set the stage, what we want to discuss this morning is what's happened at least since the Trump-Kim summit here in Singapore. The sequence of meetings that have followed up that Trump-Kim summit has not been a stellar record. It is natural to ask if there has been real change. At the Pompeo meeting in Pyongyang in July, there were references made to regrettable American attitudes. Both sides are recognizing more and more that deals are reversible, and DPRK expectations on US offers in DPRK's eyes have not been met. More upbeat than in October, again in Pyongyang, but thanks to the Inter-Korea Summit in September, that meeting was much more positive. But then in November, we have postponed US DPRK meetings again, and significantly, a DPRK weapons test of what was euphemistically referred to as an ultra-modern tactical weapon, with Kim Jong-un himself personally thanking the defense scientists and industry workers and not mentioning at all any understanding with either the United States or South Korea. So if the military and government establishments around Trump and Kim remain pessimistic or at best lukewarm, one question is, have the two leaders unhelpfully personalized the issue by becoming such great buddies after the Singapore summit? What exactly is the state of the denuclearization talks? Does everyone else in the world, China, Japan, yet others, view progress the same way as the US and Korea? What obstacles remain? What do we need to do next? Now, I'm going to mention all the names before they come up to the panel, but after I end, I want to invite you to join me in applauding how they've come so far to join us here this morning. Kiichi Fujiwara from Japan, John Ikenberry from Princeton, Kim Sung-han from Korea University, Drew Thompson, our own Lee Kuan Yew School visiting senior research fellow, and Chang Ching-min from Peking University. Could you join me in welcoming them up on stage? Each of these interlocutors will open with a 10-minute statement, after which I want to invite you, the audience, to join in the conversation. We will need to end the session at 11 o'clock, but I would like now to turn to John Ikenberry first to kick off the session.
Thank you, Danny. It's great to be here. It's worth all the hours of flight to be here to see old friends again and to renew our conversation from a year ago. It was a great meeting last year. This one will be as well. We've always kidded over the years, 10 years now, that each meeting we gathered to talk about cooperation and security agreements and so forth, but the world itself keeps getting worse. To some extent, we might argue this year it's a little different in that when we look back on last year, things probably were worse than they are now. So let me just say a few things about this. I think when we look at the North Korea problem today, there is good news and bad news, or at least varying degrees of bad news. A year ago, on November 28th of last year, North Korea successfully launched a test of an ICBM missile, the longest of 25 missile launches that they tested in 2017. Secretary Mattis at the Pentagon said the missile had the potential to threaten everywhere in the world. It was a new game changer capability that North Korea had. Kim Jong-un announced that he had succeeded in establishing deterrence in a way he had not done before. In his words, before the eyes of the world, we have a deterrent. After that, and that, if you remember, was the time of discussion of a preemptive strike, the so-called bloody nose option. Victor Cha, who was under consideration, maybe even had been nominated informally as the next ambassador to South Korea, was told that he was no longer in the running, partly because he expressed his worries about the use of force option that was being contemplated by the White House. But then things pivoted fairly quickly in the new year. North Korea launched a charm offensive in the face of what the US has called maximum pressure sanctions. And then Kim Jong-un engaged in a series of summits that in some sense are still ongoing. He met with President Xi, with President Moon and President Trump, offering small steps, blowing up a test site, offering to and pledging to dismantle launch sites. So that was the good news, you might say. But the bad news is very little has changed. There's very little evidence that we are on a road to the Singapore summit commitments. The US intelligence agency suggests that North Korea is still working on nuclear and missile programs. There are news reports that North Korea may be engaging in uranium enrichment and working on at least 20 different sites for mobile launchers that would allow them to hide and then redeploy these launchers in a moment of crisis. Things do not seem to be moving in a way that you could call a road to denuclearization. North and South Korea, nonetheless, are continuing to warm their relations, reduce tensions, reducing guard posts and demining along the DMZ. And so if we were to measure all of that together, I think we would say that there is at least a moment that we're in now where we're not on the brink of war. Diplomacy seems to be happening with very uncertain results. It seems to me, stepping back and looking at this, there are two ways to think about what is happening. One is the optimistic view that North Korea and South Korea and the United States are in a process, a serious negotiation, a give and take. There are real issues on the table, and that this process still unfolding, still not quite getting traction, nonetheless has the ability to take these countries down to the path of North Korea denuclearization. In some sense, if this is where we are, South Korea is operating as the good cop, the US pledging to continue sanctions is the bad cop, North Korea says we need trust, the US says, okay, but we need to keep the sanctions until there is truly denuclearization. This is President Moon's vision. But it is optimistic because it assumes two things. Number one, North Korea really is willing to deal away its weapons for a price we don't yet know, but they are willing to put that on the table. And secondly, there is a logical process of give and take, of reciprocal exchanges of concessions that you could imagine temporarily, sequentially organized so that each gets the assurances it wants as they move down this path towards denuclearization. That would be one world that we may be in. A second possibility is that we're in a slow motion process towards the normalization of North Korea as a nuclear state. There might be, as we see this unfolding, an implicit deal that is slowly taking shape, that North Korea will not be provocative. It will refrain from testing, even as it improves its capabilities, but not doing what it did all throughout 2017, testing both program and missiles. In return, South Korea and the United States will relax sanctions and not push for a clear-cut into the North Korean programs. This second, what I would say, more pessimistic scenario of where we are rests on two assumptions as well. Number one, that North Korea has no intention of giving up its weapons, and number two, pushing them to do so is not worth the price of war that would be threatened, need to be threatened for it to happen. If so, if it's the second world we're in, Singapore summit was simply theater, and Kim Jong-un won. Now, some people will be happy with this second best outcome. There are people, Jeffrey Lewis, who has said, you've got to acknowledge that North Korea is not going to give up its weapons, and the second best option is simply to make those weapons as safe as possible by in some sense, exchanging acknowledgement of them for their reciprocal pledge to be careful with them. Stability is more important than disarmament. And there is voices really in the security community that accept this, that we should be thinking about shifting the problem of North Korea from a non-proliferation problem to a deterrence problem. So those are two different possibilities. Upon reflection, there's a third possibility, and that is that the United States thinks we're in the first world, and North Korea thinks we're in the second world. That is to say, the US thinks this is a serious negotiation. What was agreed to in Singapore was an agreement that his buddy, Kim Jong-un, who's now in love with, or at least loved by, President Trump, they have a thing, and they are serious. It's going to take a while, but the US is convinced that they agreed to something. But at the same time, North Korea, of course, does not believe this, that they believe that the future world that they are moving towards is reduced sanctions, not necessarily full normalization, but holding on to those weapons and letting the sheer difficulties of pressure, politics, ultimately fail. If those are if that's where we're at, where there are true misunderstandings here, and this is what I think is the case, talks could well stall. Maybe they've already stalled. The US will keep sanctions on, and with those sanctions, North Korea will continue to say, well, if we don't see trust, if we don't see movement, we will return to our programs of testing. And that then brings us back to square one, which is a very dangerous place to be indeed. Alas, I think that's where we're headed.
Thank you, John. So valuably, insightfully setting out the stage for us. Kiichi, can I invite you to join in now?
No, thank you, Danny. I must say that I'm very happy to be in Singapore again. This is not only my favorite city, this also has become the peace capital of the world. If there is
Except with Malaysia, you know.
If there's one victor, somebody who gained from the recent summit between DPRK and the United States, that was Singapore, that somehow ensured the reputation as a center of diplomacy in the region. From Japan, I dare say that the summit was met with, well, skeptical eyes, and there was not much expectation that the summit meeting between DPRK and the United States would bring about denuclearization as has been discussed before. And there was also an element of surprise. The same president who used the word fire and fury between, say, DPRK and the United States, suddenly changing and accepting a summit talk with the North Korean leader, which we were all aware as one of the main objectives that the North Korean leadership always wished to be realized. So who is this guy who's been strongly reacting against North Korean leadership using words such as maximum pressure, and then suddenly almost giving in to the request from North Korean leadership? There was also some skepticism about denuclearization, because what the word means for the United States, or for that matter Japan, and what the word means for North Korea were clearly different. You can see that denuclearization was not the first point in the joint agreement between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, and also the words were extremely ambiguous. The American expectation was, of course, that this will be a beginning of a dismantling of nuclear capability, present and future, in North Korea, period. This was not about denuclearization, denuclearizing American forces. This was about denuclearizing North Korea. There was a difference here. And then when we listen to discussion coming from North Korea, the same word denuclearization means something quite different. And this is about changing the strategic environment in the Korean Peninsula, which may include dismantling of North Korean nuclear capabilities, but should most certainly accompany a dramatic change in, say, US security commitments and alliance structure and deployment of weapons and armed forces in the East Asian region in general. So we're talking about two very different things here. And what you can anticipate is that each side would start arguing that you haven't kept your commitments, so we're not going to do anything. And that's exactly what's happening right now. The dismantling of test sites is not really a major achievement when we focus on denuclearizing North Korea. So there is a tremendous gap between the two. I would say that the Japanese public were quite supportive of the summit talks. There is always a hope in the public that any move toward dismantling of nuclear weapons is a good thing, and any move toward tension reduction in the region is good. The whole meeting was covered by the news media, TV, newspapers, and in spite of what specialists, including myself, I guess, been saying, which tended to be rather more reserved and skeptical, the reaction from the public in general, as you can see in the public opinion polls, was quite supportive. That support has waned down significantly. And right now there is some growing awareness that we have not moved much further. Now, underlying this North Korean crisis or changes, there are 2 points that should be pointed out. One is, well, to put it very bluntly, China. In Tokyo, there has been a strong awareness of the rise of China, both economically and militarily. And the North Korean issue was seen in connection to the rise of China. What's the relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang? Is Beijing calling the shots? Does Beijing really have an influence to change behavior of the government in Pyongyang? The initial reaction toward the promised summit talk was that, wow, this could be a chance where the DPRK is moving away from China. There was this false expectation, if I may, early this year, that North Korea is moving away from China and we should make much of it and use it in a way that DPRK's relations with China will change. It didn't happen. As a matter of fact, Beijing maintained an extremely strong relationship with Pyongyang even before the summit and also after the summit. So the China scare that is quite prevalent with good reasons in Japan is still very much there in the way we see the issue. The second issue is about, well, if I may, the Trump administration and the future of alliance. With the new administration in Washington, there was certain awareness that President Trump may be more skeptical about maintaining alliance structure in East Asia, including Tokyo, Seoul, or for that matter, Canberra. Now, how this will change was a matter of public debate, but when the United States announced that they would not hold the joint military exercises with South Korea, this sent a certain alarm that this could be a beginning of a U.S. disengagement from the region. It's going a bit too far. I mean, it's not something we see, but there was this awareness. We already saw two occasions before of possible reshifting of the alliance. And that was in 1970s with Nixon's visit to China, somehow passing Tokyo's position. This somehow loosened up the alliance structure and US commitment. And then there was another occasion in the 1990s. And with the end of the Cold War, there was a concern that the US might reconsider security commitment to the region. And although it has not become so salient as before, with the Trump administration, there is a possibility of the United States rethinking and engagement and commitment in the security structure. Three last points. This whole situation depends on what point you want to focus on. If you are interested in non-proliferation of nuclear capabilities, this is not really moving that much. When Mr. Trump announced his intention to meet Mr. Kim Jong-un, the United States also pulled out from the Iran nuclear deal. Yeah. And that is the only multinational non-proliferation agreement that was made that does not include regime changes. Usually, nuclear non-proliferation accompanies change of regime, such as the one we saw in South Africa, for example. This was different. In Iran, we did not see a regime change, but nonetheless, we won certain commitments on denuclearization. So you're pulling out from one deal, and you're counting on a deal that does not exist. That doesn't mean much to us. So in terms of denuclearization, I don't think much has happened. The second point is about stability. If you're from South Korea, some people in South Korea might see this as a stabilizing process of relation between North and South. North Korea and South Korea, of course, has been facing strong military competition, and somehow easing the tension between North and South means a tremendous amount to people living in the Korean Peninsula. The question is whether this can be sustained. I very much doubt that. Of course, this improvement of North-South relations is almost totally dependent on action that may come from the North Korean government, which we do not see as concrete as President Trump seems to think. So we see an improvement of diplomatic relations that may not be sustained in the future. Finally, as being more pessimistic than my good friend John here, I'd like to tell you some of the worst-case scenarios. One worst-case scenario would be Mr. Trump moving back to fire and fury position. I hope it's unlikely, but I can't assure you of that. And when North Korea does not deliver what Mr. Trump hopes Kim Jong-un would deliver, then American policy might move back to a confrontational stance against North Korea. This time it could be worse because the blame would be not only on Pyongyang but also on Beijing. Now, if there was anything positive, China had been more cooperative in the policy toward North Korea since, at least since last year, and has joined economic sanctions. I don't think much has been going on in economic sanction against North Korea from China at this moment. And when Mr. Trump, who is in love with Mr. Kim Jong-un, cannot understand the current situation, the easiest way is that China is pushing North Korea away from denuclearization. So then we have a perfect storm which combines our anxiety about China's future action and the crisis in Pyongyang, and we are together here to avoid that worst-case scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, Kichi. Both your presentations, John and Kichi, have been so rich and textured, so subtle. I thought that a common theme I picked out from both of yours is how there remains a misalignment of understanding and expectations on both sides. John, you spoke about the First World World I understanding and a World II understanding, where America thinks that we've actually gone into serious negotiations with North Korea, but North Korea thinks of it as a slow motion process still. And Kiichi, you talked about how the US expectation was about dismantling of the nuclear weapons, whereas North Korea understands this simply to be changing the strategic environment.
That's right.
And of course, I wonder if, and both of you also made reference to the Trump-Kim great bromance. And I wonder if there's a third misunderstanding creeping in here where the political and military establishments around these two leaders have quite a different view of what's happening than these two great lovers at this point. I would like now to turn to...
Not a pleasant thought.
No.
Sorry, now all of you are going to have that image in your head.
Well, none, you're worse than I am.
I know, that's the real pessimistic scenario.
Yeah. Right.
Sung-han, can I invite you to join in the conversation?
Thank you, Danny. First of all, I'd like to thank Lee Kuan-yew School of Public Policy, represented by Danny Kuo, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak to a great audience. As my previous two speakers already pointed out, Trump-Kim summit in Singapore was a good start, if not sufficient, because it confirmed the possibility that Kim Jong-un is willing to negotiate over denuclearization. However, North Korea's behavior after the Singapore summit and 3 inter-Korean summits and others, it's still dragging its feet and tries to draw concessions from the United States in return for North Korea's kind of a self-initiated denuclearization, which is not based upon kind of an agreed roadmap for denuclearization. North Korea has not declared its nuclear inventory yet, although it has suspended the nuclear and missile tests and closed a nuclear test site at Punggye of North Korea. United States, on the other hand, believes it has reciprocated North Korea's actions by suspending US-North Korea joint military exercises. Most importantly, North Korea expressed quite recently its willingness to dismantle nuclear facilities in Yongbyon. As you know, Yongbyon is kind of a hub of North Korea's nuclear capabilities with the presence of observers. If there's a big if, US took corresponding measures. In this vein, North Korea has been demanding so-called the end of war declaration, end of the Korean War declaration, That was referred to as the corresponding measures North Korea has wanted. But the problem is the United States is yet to accept the North Korean proposal to end the Korean War, because it is premature. If we took this kind of a declaration, that might be impacting the variety of strategic issues affiliated with the United States, such as ROK US Alliance, the status of United Nations Command, and the military presence on the Korean Peninsula, etc. So we might be discussing end of war declaration at some point in the future, probably after North Korea took some meaningful denuclearization measures. Then North Korea has shown some sort of agility by shifting from the end of war declaration to the demand for the lifting of sanctions. If not the end of war declaration, United States needs to ease at least sanctions against North Korea. That would be interpreted as meaningful corresponding measures that would lead to the dismantlement of nuclear facilities in Yongbyon. But again, United States appears to be refusing the North Korean demand. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence pointed out last month, I think it was November 15th, said that North Korea doesn't have to declare its nuclear programs right now, but if a second U.S.-North Korea summit happened, it will have to produce kind of a roadmap for denuclearization, which means North Korea has to bring something meaningful when Kim Jong-un comes to the second summit. Otherwise, the second summit will probably have to be postponed. So that was a very strong message by saying that the second summit will have to be substantial and significant without just exchanging words. This remark, I think, raises two questions. The first one is whether North Korea will agree on setting this issue, the roadmap issue, as an agenda for the next summit. That is a very important issue. Rather than having North Korea continue to do kind of a self-initiated denuclearization measures. North Korea doesn't want to declare its nuclear capabilities. North Korea just mentions, I will do this, I will do that for some time in the future, at some time in the future, and then they gives a lot of credit to that action. Then they raise a question of kind of a mutual suspicion, which has to be dealt with between United States and North Korea. That is somewhat misleading. So if you are really serious about denuclearization, you have to agree on what kind of steps you are taking from now on. Okay, it could be taking some amount of time, but you have to start from a certain agreed action and move on to next actions. The second question is whether, by the way, President Trump shares the same idea with Mike Pence. Probably North Korea believes Trump might have a different idea than foreign policy establishment in Washington. That's why North Korea has been rather hesitant to deal with specific, working level issues, even higher level, talks with, the Secretary Pompeo, or even working level talks between Choi Sun-hee and Biegun. So they just rely on President Trump. That is, I would say, kind of a de-linking strategy. De-link President Trump from the foreign policy establishment. So kind of a political deal rather than a technical deal would be preferable from the North Korean point of view. North Korea might have thought that this kind of strategy would be workable before US midterm elections. But as you know, President Trump didn't use a North Korean nuclear card to win midterm elections. Now President Trump might have a different idea. He said right after the elections, we are not in such a big rush, which means time is on his side. In a nutshell, the current deadlock, if I may, comes from two reasons. The first one, US-North Korea's positions have become very clear, as I already pointed out. North Korea wants the easing of economic sanctions and or end of war declaration. United States wants North Korea to agree on very transparent, clear roadmap for denuclearization. Against this backdrop, President Moon Jae-in of the Republic of Korea is gearing up to have Kim Jong-un to visit the South. Kim Jong-un might be tempted to do this, to make a visit to the South for the sake of attracting attention from President Trump, for the sake of making him jealous, while boosting up so-called progressive forces in South Korean politics. On the other hand, Kim Jong-un, if he visits South Korea, will have to face very strong opposing protests on the street, and we'll probably have to bring something meaningful gift, hinting at the progress in denuclearization. Otherwise, that is another reality show which will be taking place in the South Korean capital. So that is not going to be such an easy business. So on that cautiously pessimistic note, let me stop there. Thank you.
Cautiously. Thank you, Sohan. Among the many different points you raised, Sohan, was one of what we should be looking for in terms of deliverables, whether it's a roadmap or something else for the second summit. In fact, whether the second summit will happen at all, we need some clarity. We need some clarity ahead of time on what we might be looking for.
Mm-hmm.
They'd have to be able to promise something more than just nice words.
Yeah.
I would like now to turn to Zhang Qingmin from PITA to give us his views.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Denuclearization Public School of Public Policy for giving me this opportunity to share my observation and views on this issue. And secondly, I want to make use of this opportunity to thank my former boss, our dean, Professor Jia Qinggu, who have led us all the years in this program, including along with other great leadership. I think I would like to discuss 4 points about the implications of the Kim-Trump summit in Singapore. And the first implication is that this summit shows the North Korean nuclear issue can only be solved through diplomatic means. We should have noticed that before the summit, the North Korea and the United States were engaging in a game of brinkmanship. They exchanged fire and fury. And on one side, North Korea escalated its process in developing nuclear weapons. And the United States and South Korea accelerated its joint military exercises, and the sanctions has become increasing. So, but after the summit, we've seen that the two leaders expressed their ideas. They are not only in love, but they now began to trust each other. At least Trump said he began to trust Kim, and Kim also expressed similar views. This shows that after the summit, we see that the brinkman, we are now away from the brinkmanship. Or if we consider North Korean nuclear issue as a time bomb, at least after the summit, we've seen that this bomb has stopped smoking. And this is a good sign. The next step is how to stop the, remove the time bomb. So this tells us that dialogue is better than pressure. Communication is the only way to increase trust. And the trust is the only means to the final settlement of the nuclear issue. This is the first point. Secondly, I think a lot of people think that the summit has been a failure. But I do not think that way, because I think the summit is simply a starting point rather than a final point. And we need more follow-up steps, whether they will have a second summit or a third summit. Perhaps the road step need to 3 or more summits to work out a detailed roadmap, because we know that the devil is in the details. It takes more time to work out that. But now we have seen that on the one hand, North Korea has taken a lot of measures, and according to David Kahn, who published in New York Times, North Korea has taken about 7 steps, including the moratorium of the nuclear test and the missile test, and the destruction of dismantling its one of the nuclear test and the missile site. And the North Korea has retained the remains of American soldiers during the Korean War. There are a lot of other, North Korea also has, downgraded its propaganda against the United States. So I think those, measures from the North side need to be reciprocated by the US side, which we have now seen this kind of reciprocal measures. So if we look at the very nature of the North Korean nuclear issue, the two countries are facing two different problems. Not for North Korea, it is facing a survival problem. For the United States, it is facing a problem on how to maintain stability or secure, or absolutely secure. For North Korea, we Chinese have a proverb which goes like this: even a rabbit could bite if you put it in a very desperate corner. The North Korea's danger is that once it is in a desperate position, it might be, engaged in a deadlock war or some, possible, tactics. But on the U.S. side, so the U.S. is pursuing a strategy of which I can call it the absolute security of the United States and its allies. But as Henry Kissinger's one side, the absolute security of one country is the absolute insecurity of the other country, especially its own enemy. So in this regard, I think if we want to solve the problem between North Korea and the United States, and I think the Chinese proposed a dual suspension. That is, on the one hand, North Korea suspend its nuclear missile test, but on the other hand, the United States and South Korea suspend its joint military exercise, and just concerted step will be the way. Can you talk about the fear about China? I understand that kind of fear around the globe. But on North Korea issue, it offers an example that China should not be feared, because China does not have the means to implement what it wanted. For example, many of you discussed the possibility how China can put pressure on North Korea to dismantle North Korean nuclear capability. But North Korea might be in a similar position to pressure China to demand the United States to make commitment to North Korea, not to invade or to provide a security guarantee to North Korea. So China cannot, put pressure on the two sides. We could not do that. I think China is unable to do so. So this is the problem. But the due suspension suggestion and the due track strategy, which is on the one hand denuclearization, but on the other hand to replace the North Korea issue with a peace mechanism, there might be a possible roadmap in the future. This is the second point I want to make. The third point is that after the summit in Singapore, we've seen it has, started a dynamic diplomatic, reshuffle in East Asia, in Northeast Asian area. On the one hand, just Professor Kim discussed that there was 2 or 3 inter-Korean summits, and there are also Pompeo has visited Seoul, Pyongyang for 3 times. We have also seen that President Xi Jinping and Kim also met for 3 times. And now we see that on the one hand, China, North Korea, and Russia. Our Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Russia and coordinated with Russia on this issue. We will see at this very moment on the North Korean nuclear issue, we find on the one hand there's China, North Korea, and Russia, but on the other hand, we see South Korea, Japan, and the United States, they are coordinating separately. This reminds us of some historical clues because the Korean Peninsula has always been the focal and the starting point of each of the power shifts in East Asia. The first time in 1894-95, when China was defeated by Japan in the Korean Peninsula area. China lost its control there, and it started the Japanese dominance in East Asia. That's the first time. The second time was in 1950 and 1953, after the after the Korean War. The Cold War front was frozen along the 38th parallel. So now there is a likelihood, now we are facing a third power shift in East Asia. And this kind of power shift will start, it will happen, will also start from the Korean Peninsula. How the North Korean nuclear issue is settled, how the Korean Peninsula problem will be solved, will have some big implications for the future power structure in East Asia. This is the third point I want to make. The fourth point I want to make is about the US-China relations. It is true that China was not the main part of this, nuclear conundrum. And the main party is North Korea and the United States. But we cannot deny that the final settlement of North Korean nuclear issue has to be put in that larger framework of US-China relations. I'm now saying that the US-China relation will determine how this will be settled. But we can find that there is a coincidence, from 2003 to 2009, when the six-party talks was going on very well. That was exactly the time when China and the US relations were very good. Even though we blame North Korea for stopping participating in the six-party talks, but 2009 was the time when Chinese foreign policy began to be considered as assertive, and the US policy began to be considered as Asian pivoting. So there is a coincidence. Look into the future. We find that there are a lot of global issues, like North Korean nuclear issue, like climate change issue, like anti-terrorist issue, all those issues need China and the United States to cooperate. I would like to say that, if China and the United States we cooperate, many of the issues might not be able to be solved. But I can guarantee that if China and the United States do not cooperate, none of the global issues could be solved. And the North Korean issue gives a very good example of how our two sides should cooperate. We have one common goal, that is to have North Korea denuclearized. But we have other interests, like China cherish the stability and the peace in this area. America also has its own priority. How we can, reconcile our differences in our interest, that is the problem. And how in the future we to solve those, to seek the same goal, and how to iron out our differences in the methods. From this perspective, I think I'm very pessimistic considering the current US-China relations. So just now, Professor Kim has discussed that, Professor Kichi, and we discussed that, you discussed that the relation between China and the United States at this very moment, and whether China has a softened its sanction on North Korea. I do not have those evidence, but the logical, if that has happened, I think the logic should be very clear. That is, United States, or you cannot expect China to help the United States or help with these major problems. Well, our better relation is in a difficult problem. We having economic sanctions or increased tariffs, and and a lot of other problems in better relations. I think North Korean nuclear issue, we come to the point it took for more than 1 decade to come to the current status. Perhaps it needed longer time to finally solve it. We cannot expect that one summit or two summits will solve the problem, but we think from this last summit in Singapore, we can tell that summit diplomatic channels is the only means to reach the goal to finally solve the North Korean nuclear issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingmin. Thank you also for especially helping us think through how important the issues are for Korea generally, the Korean Peninsula specifically. There are implications also for the regional landscape. How historically, whether for reasons of physical geography or otherwise, Korea has been the focal point of reshaping the regional geopolitics. Really interesting observations. Thank you very much. I'd like now to turn to one of our own, Drew Thompson. Could you give us your views as well?
Thank you, Danny. It's an old think tank curse, right? May you go last on a very interesting panel. But in a way, it's also a blessing, too, because you've got a very rich discussion to draw on. So I'll throw out whatever I'd prepared to say and respond a bit to what's been said. But I think I'll make 3 points. I'll take a look at the USROK relationship and how the alliance is a factor here, because that's critical. I'll comment a bit on China's role, and I'll also give some insights what I think the U.S. domestic consideration is, or the U.S. political situation is. I mean, I think one of the key risks that we face here, and clearly, if you ask who's winning and who's losing, I think the only winners here are the pessimists. The challenge here is, and things like maintaining the USROK Alliance is critically important in such a bigger, larger way than just the North Korea issue. And ensuring alliance alignment is critical. I mean, one of the concerns I think that people have is that currently the two countries have different objectives on the peninsula. President Moon is seeking reconciliation between the two Koreas, while the United States is primarily concerned with denuclearization. So right there you have a divergence of interests and end states that potentially cause friction in the alliance. I think one good piece of news is that back in mid-November there was the announcement that there would be a working group formed between the US and the ROK to align those two issues. So that's positive. One thing I'd point out, though, I know there's a lot of questions about President Trump and his perspective on alliances in the region, and obviously I mean, he's new to politics, right? This is his first government job. He's, settling in. But, he comes to government with a businessman's mentality. And it's hard to translate that into the business of politics, the business of security. And it's something that, all of Washington clearly struggles with. One of the observations that I had was, you couldn't just go and say the alliance is good. You'd have to explain to them. I mean, the closest thing to a businessman in IR is essentially a realist, right? They're not just concerned with the framework, they're concerned with the inputs, they're concerned with the outputs. So just like a business person, you don't worry about how much money you invest, you worry about how much profit you're going to get from it. So it's what comes out of the process is what concerns you. So for President Trump, you can't just go and say to him, we have to support the alliance, it's good. You have to be able to present to him the benefits to the United States from the alliance are as follows. And then it's in a context where he suddenly becomes very supportive of the architecture. So I think I personally would question the strategy of using President Moon as an intermediary in the process for the United States, because, as I said, he's got different objectives. So unless you have assurances, unless there's a roadmap between the U.S. and the ROK, you're not ready to start having a roadmap with Korea. And obviously, domestic politics within Korea are critical, as Professor Kim pointed out. You've got conservatives who are deeply suspicious of the rapprochement approach. Let me switch to China. I mean, China remains a critical factor. It's interesting, in my opinion, I think China's taken a much lower key approach to the effort on North Korea than they have in the past or during the six-party talks. So it's a lower profile, but I still think it's a critically important one. And certainly, China's a key factor in terms of how sanctions are implemented, because the sanctions haven't changed, but the implementation of them has. And that, of course, affects the North Korean calculation. But that said, I think generally China should be satisfied with progress so far. They're being actively consulted by all sides. Their interests are being actively considered. So at this point, I don't think China has as much to fear of coming out on the short end of an agreement. But as Professor Zhang points out, the U.S.-China relationship is very complex. There's an awful lot of variables, and it's almost impossible to have a grand bargain because there are so many different variables, and the trade space isn't equal, right? The perceptions of different issues is not the same from either side. So it's not like currencies where everyone has a common market and can agree how much a dollar is worth against the renminbi, against the Japanese yen. People's offerings have different values. So, for instance, the U.S. doesn't value the dismantling of a test stand or the closing of a nuclear test site that has limited functionality after so many tests anyway. So those are not considered credible offers on the part of the U.S., whereas North Korea considers them to be a great gift that now U.S. has to reciprocate. Well, the United States may just send them a box of puppies and say, hey, this is what we give you back. Who doesn't love puppies, right? If you don't value them, it's not a good trade. And I think that's where the roadmap is critical. Obviously, process really matters in this case, and we're all talking about the issues, but nobody really thinks about the process. I mean, how do you get there? And we talk about the summits being important, but in my opinion, in a perfect world, the summits are really there for closing the deal. It's all the work that's done before the summit that affects the outcome. And you can't expect the president to have a meaningful negotiation on nuclear fuel cycles and reprocessing. They're not capable of doing that. So having a functioning working level dialogue is critical between the two sides and coordination at that level. And we're not seeing that. So put me in the pessimist bucket there. I think the U.S. is going to be challenged to meet that expectation cycle with North Korea in terms of deliverables. Starting in January, there's going to be a Democratic-controlled House of Congress that's going to be very reluctant to give President Trump any substantive foreign policy wins. But also they'll be very reluctant to do things like permit the president to reduce sanctions and restrictions against North Korea. So in some ways, his hands are going to be tied. Again, the Trump dynamic is really critical here, and it's interesting, and it's both good and bad, right? I mean, President Trump has a very high tolerance for risk, which is why he's able to go and meet with Kim, and why he's able to start a process and put maximum pressure to have a desired effect. So he's fearless in that respect, which is great because he's willing to challenge what's essentially a very unsatisfactory status quo. But of course, there's a downside to that. It's frightening, right? Fire and fury, and my button is bigger than yours. It's disconcerting to people who are concerned about stability and essentially maintaining that status quo. So again, mixed bag. From that process perspective, same thing. It's a blessing to have a boss that's put your counterparts essentially on the defensive. They're on the back heel. They're reacting to us. That's a wonderful position to be in when you're negotiating. The problem is your boss is also unpredictable, so you're not quite sure what how you're going to handle those negotiations, or whether you'll be able to make a credible offer at the table if your boss doesn't have credibility in the counterpart's eyes. So that's another factor that really has to be considered. Yeah, it's hard to be optimistic. There's no way around that. Without the contours of a deal being mapped out prior to the next summit, it's hard for me to see the functional value going in. But that said, I think having dialogue is important, and whether it's at the presidential level or at the special ambassadorial level, I think we also have to accept that there's a certain amount of communication that's going on that we're not privy to, and that we don't need to be privy to. I mean, we understand there's a CIA channel that's taking place. The Korea Mission Analysis Cell is leading that dialogue. There's the New York channel. So I think that should be reassuring, but of course, that doesn't need to be playing out in the press for our benefit. And that hopefully increases the success of a summit as well. But again, we don't have even a common agreement on the lexicon or the outcome, whether it's denuclearization of the peninsula or denuclearization of the DPRK. And I think until you start having that, the joint statement at the end of the Singapore summit left, I think, a lot of people very dissatisfied for exactly that reason. And I think a goal perhaps should be to go back to the six-party talks era and go dig out the September 2005 six-party talks joint statement, which I think laid out much more clearly an end state that's acceptable to all the key parties. I promised to keep on the 10 minutes, and there it is.
Okay, thank you, Drew, for that extra discipline, and for that very high-level practitioner take on these things that are going on, not just the perspective from academics. I'd like now to open up the discussion to members of the audience, but before I do that, as you prepare to do that, I'm going to invite you to go up to the standing microphones and maybe say a word to introduce yourselves, and then pose a question or give us your view. But while you're preparing to do that, I'd like to invite the panel possibly to respond to what anybody else has said that you feel a particularly burning wish to, or add to any of your statements. If not, then I know we've got a very high-level audience here. I see members of the highest levels of the diplomatic corps, very distinguished professors, members of the school, people from outside the school as well, people from the other campus of the National University of Singapore. So the floor is now yours. Questions to pose, contributions to add to the conversation.
My name is Sojin Shin from the Institute of South Asian Studies at Kentridge campus. I have a question to Professor Kim Sung-han and Dr. Thompson about the domestic politics in two Koreas. Well, in the peace process, well, I strongly feel that South Korea's Moon Jae-in, President Moon Jae-in has been developing a bilateral relationship with North Korea through the series of people-to-people contact and also infrastructure development process. And well, I am wondering about your intake about, well, whether there will be still some possible optimistic scenario in the peace process or toward the peace process through Moon Jae-in government with North Korea, even if the Trump goes back to fire and fury, that policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So question about the internal domestic politics on the Koreas and the US. Actually, if possible, I'd like to bring a China perspective in on this, because China's domestic politics are, of course, also undergoing an extremely interesting change. But perhaps, Drew, you could kick us off?
Sure. I mean, I guess on the one hand, there's not a strong pro-North Korea lobby within the United States, to say the least. So there's not a lot of push to reach an accommodation with North Korea on the basis of, for instance, inter-Korean peace. What there is, of course, is the concern about the threat to U.S. national security, and that's the dominant voice, and that's the one that's going to resonate the loudest, and it's the threat from essentially the nuclear device and the ability to mate it to a ballistic missile that can deliver it. I mean, that's at the most base the concern of the U.S. domestic audience. And it's, I think everyone agrees in the national security community that North Korea is right on the verge of being able to do that, even if they haven't actually demonstrated the capabilities. So that's the primary U.S. interest, and that's what's going to be essentially focused on. So in a way, all the rest of this, discussion is almost ancillary. It's a distraction. It's really about preventing the ability to launch the ICBM and deliver a payload to either a U.S. ally, a U.S. base, or the U.S. homeland. So that's the top priority. And that's what the U.S. is invariably going to really zero in on focus on. So the question is, how do you get there?
Thank you. Sung-han?
I think three factors have contributed to making Kim Jong-un come to the negotiating table. The first one is Chinese kind of a very serious effort to join international pressure. And secondly, the U.S. So-called maximum pressure policy, hinting at the use of military force against North Korea. Certainly, President Moon Jae-in's determination to play as an intermediary or mediator between North Korea and the United States. That kind of third factor is premised upon the assumption that inter-Korean cooperation will be contributing to making North Korea reassured and really making a progress in denuclearization. But I disagree about that point, that inter-Korean cooperation will contribute to denuclearization of North Korea. I think the mediating role of South Korea is kind of a equidistant kind of a policy vis-a-vis North Korea and the United States. Of course, South Korea is kind of a party who is sharing blood with its northern brethren. But at the same time, ROK US alliance relationship is based on the fact that we have shed blood over the Korean War as well as the Vietnam War. So this is making things more ambivalent. This is making South Korean position more and more ambivalent. The good side is that you can send kind of a goodwill gesture to North Korea with the expectation that North Korea will be reciprocating those goodwill gestures. But North Korea, I believe, expecting South Korea to play as a kind of a human shield against possible kind of maximum pressure policy of the United States. So they might be thinking in a different ways. So I think South Korea in that sense needs to send a clear message rather than just solely working on inter-Korean cooperation. If North Korea shows really sincere denuclearization efforts, such as the agreement on the comprehensive roadmap for denuclearization, I think South Korean companies would not hesitate at all to go to the North to invest. But if South Korean government twists their arms to invest in the North, that is not quite helpful. I'm not saying South Korean government is doing so, but if that kind of a logic is in there, I think that is quite unrealistic.
Thank you so much. Ching-Min, I want to bring a China perspective into the discussion of internal domestic politics and what's happening in the Korean Peninsula, if I may. One of the outgrowths of the US-China trade war discussion is a lively debate on how this might be used, how it's being affected by internal political discussion in China. You say that China is obviously very constrained in the actions it can take on the Korean Peninsula, but nonetheless China's view matters, and matters greatly. So I wonder if you could connect for us the dots on what China is thinking inside in terms of its domestic discussion and these developments with DPRK.
First of all, if it comes to China-US relations, the domestic politics plays a very important role because it concerns many sectors' interest whose interests might not be the same. So there are a lot of discussions about that. But as far as China's policy toward North Korea, I think this is a high political issue. And the Chinese policy ever since 2003 when China got involved has now changed. First, denuclearization, stability and peace, and settled through diplomatic means. Those has now changed so far. So in this regard, I think that the domestic political issue developing in China, which is very dynamic in the last few years, has not affected the general idea and the logic behind the Chinese North Korean policy. But if you look at the Chinese policy toward North Korea from the bureaucratic political perspective, I just want to offer one point which I have noticed in my study. That is China's relation with North Korea is basically managed by the International Liaison Department of the CCP Central Committee rather than the Foreign Ministry. Because the last three visits by Kim Jong-un were all arranged by the International Liaison Department of the CCP Central Committee rather than the Foreign Ministry. And the last and the current Chinese ambassador to North Korea were both the Deputy Minister of the International Liaison Department of the CCP Central Committee rather than from the Foreign Ministry. I think this might have some implications on how China look at North Korea and how it addresses the policy in daily management. But I do not see that the politics in China has affect to what extent the Chinese policy to North Korea.
Interesting, thank you. John, if I could turn to you. Drew has already made reference to how after the US midterm elections, the composition of the houses of Congress will have changed. I wonder if I could invite you to explore a little bit more what implications that might have on this discussion with DPRK.
Well, I think it's probably not going to have a direct impact. I think there will be the House will now be under Democratic control, and the way in which the midterms will affect American foreign policy is very indirectly through the committee hearing system and just the shifting the domestic debate on questions of arms control and general prudence in foreign policy. So it will be very indirect. The incoming chairman of the House Foreign Services Committee is a fellow representative from, I think, Oregon, Adam Smith, who's not the original, of course. But he is going to be the first chairman of that committee ever who is comes out of the arms control community. And so he will assert his leadership in drawing attention to these sorts of issues. So there will be some impact there, I think. I think the broader kind of domestic context is going to be, as the presidential election approaches 2 years away, how will a president who will be under pressure in multiple ways, as a president who's going to probably not have a natural coalition to be reelected, who will have his base, but he needs more, and who will be under perhaps legal pressure, pressure from the economy that could turn into a recession, and domestically a stalled agenda. So foreign affairs will be a natural place for the American president to assert himself. We saw this with Nixon during the dark days of Watergate, trying to make up for domestic weakness by being an international presence. So I think you might want to look there. Now, what does that mean for North Korea? It probably means that he wants to continue, he wants to have a summit, but he wants to see some, he can't simply do another Singapore. It's going to have to be something more substantive. He looks like he's being played, so he needs his good friend who's soliciting his affection and who's being solicited himself from the other side to have something, some impact. I think no one has been optimistic today. One could, and we've all kind of been skeptical, even to the point of using it to generate humor, that these two leaders, each somewhat clownish in personality, might actually bring something creative to the table. Kim Jong-un sees Trump as somebody who possibly can contemplate more serious use of force against North Korea, but also he could imagine Trump in the way that no other American president would have, some kind of, you want us to leave the peninsula or even the region? Sure, why are we here anyway? So there's a kind of upside down. He could either unleash fire and fury, or he could liquidate all of American assets and go home. So there's at least an interesting possibility that Kim Jong-un wants to explore. And there is, on Trump's side, he may see that there's a kind of a natural experiment going on here, seeing whether there is some dynamic that could be put in place, sort of like Reagan and Gorbachev, that they are kind of each looking for a settlement and each fighting the establishments that they each have. Reagan and Gorbachev would say, you know, we have to really, we have our domestic politics, our bureaucratic politics, we've got to really stay together and fight the constraints that we're each feeling. So there might be something there. Leadership does matter. So I'm skeptical of this, but I think it's kind of interesting. But at some point, it's going to have to, I think North Korea does have to generate some credible set of actions. And the other thing that, I don't know if anybody else ever has this thought, but isn't it strange that we have never heard Kim Jong-un stand up at a lectern and make a speech about what North Korea wants in these negotiations, or generally? We spend so much time, well, this is what I think he's saying, or there is something about standing up and making a speech where you logically lay out your interests. And so if Kim Jong-un were to stand up and say, I can imagine a future for my country which would involve the gradual, negotiated disarmament of these weapons in exchange for normalization. And that is something that I want to see happen. You can't take advantage of us. We need to see reciprocity, and we want to see not all of the upfront moves made on our part. We want to see upfront moves on your part as well. But there's this kind of mystery quality. And so I think if Kim Jong-un is invited to Korea, I think the absolute requirement that President Moon has to put down is that Kim Jong-un is going to stand up, not sit like this, stand up at a podium and make a speech. At least 40 minutes, so it can't be just a little, 35 in a pinch. But there has to be language, statements, full sentences. I think we need that.
Okay. Thank you, John, for that.
Sorry, I'm a little jet lagged. So.
For that very powerful plea that world leaders should be like university professors. They get up, they actually speak. And all along I've been thinking that when university professors do this, the students just go to sleep for the 40 minutes. Obviously, it's different when a world leader does. Now, I've got a number of questions lined up already from the audience. Peter, if I may. Kichi, can I invite you to just quickly add to this if you wish? And then I'm going to go to Peter to speak on this point as well, and then I'll pick out some other questions from the floor.
No, quickly. We're surrounded by a group of leaders who think they are strong and who believe to be in command, and that's of course Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping, and President Trump. But that is also that can be applied to President Putin and President Abe and Prime Minister Abe. He's still a prime minister. And the amazing thing is that they somehow twist the data to a tailor-made narrative that is quite self-serving. I doubt if Prime Minister Abe has been successful in approach toward North Korea, or for that matter, the United States, but they can make a certain narrative that shows that great leader is making progress. And I certainly I would apply this to the discussion coming from Xi Jinping, who shows himself to be a leader and improving relationship with the United States, which actually is not the case. And that is domestic politics, how it works. You somehow form a narrative that suits the demand of the public, even if it's not true, and that applies to the days of Mr. Trump. And that also makes it very difficult for academics to put the issue in a more proper, balanced perspective, because people don't believe us. They believe the strong men.
Okay. Thank you, Kichi. Now, Peter, you wanted to add to this. Peter has been, at these meetings, a voice consistently out relating the evolution of domestic politics to the determination of foreign policy. So if you wanted to speak to this very quickly, please go up to the microphone, and then I'll pick up the questions from the floor.
Well, thank you, Danny. Actually don't have a question about domestic politics so much. I was thinking, it seems to me, listening to the discussion, which has been very good, there are different ways to think about the possibilities for managing or resolving this issue. I mean, one way is to think about it as a non-proliferation issue, and Jong and Sung Han, it seems to me, spoke very eloquently about this and about the difficulties of getting to yes. Another way to think about it is as a kind of bilateral or trilateral issue involving the United States and North Korea and South Korea. That is to link it to broader issues on the peninsula. And I think Kichi and Chingmin and to some extent Drew, in responding, talked about this. But I wonder, or I'd like to get you to think about or address thinking about this issue as part of a kind of the possibilities, at any rate, of linking it to a kind of larger grand bargain in the region by somehow connecting it to other issues, to see it more as maybe a possibility for a settlement of a broad range of issues that run from Korea to maritime issues to trade issues, and to essentially kind of view the issue against a larger canvas, kind of Kissingerian style, perhaps, where you have kind of a greater freedom of degrees of freedom, in a sense, where you impose that in connecting it. I mean, I guess maybe just the last point to make here, and maybe this does go to domestic politics. It's not hard for me to imagine a U.S. leader who's prepared to concede denuclearization as an endpoint. But it would have to be in return for other deliverables, it seems to me, in the region. I mean, I'm less certain about how a Chinese leader would think about this, but it seems to me that if it were somehow reframed, one could begin to see the possibilities. This goes to the earlier point about actually redefining the problem as a deterrence problem, the narrow problem. But it would have to be against some, you know, on a larger canvas where leaders would, in fact, other leaders would have something to show for the effort. So I guess I'm just asking maybe to get you guys to put your Kissingerian kind of glasses on and speculate about on it in those terms.
Okay. Thanks, Peter, for broadening out the discussion now. I had thought you were going to speak to the question from the last part, but I'm glad that you've brought up this whole other set of issues. In the interest of getting as many questions on board, as it were, and then inviting the panel to speak to whatever points they wish, because we're running a little bit out of time, can I invite first the gentleman in the Czech, and then after that, yourself?
Thank you. My name is Mark Thomas. I lead the Smart Cities enterprise in Asia, working quite a bit in South Korea, and I'm traveling to Pyongyang over the break to experience it firsthand. Are we still struggling with this idea of a modern nationalist-led policy? I mean, I just wonder how much the pessimism inevitably comes from the fact that for decades we've been this kind of multilateralist enhancing institution. And I wonder whether the bureaucrats, to some extent the thinkers in this space, are struggling because we haven't perhaps yet found capable or confident enough nationalist leaders, and we haven't got a firmament around guiding this new nationalist international policy, if that's not even a contradiction in terms. So it's both a comment and a question to say, I mean, do we think ultimately a nationalist-led foreign policy is doomed to fail? Or do we have leaders like Trump or Putin or Abe who need better guidance on what that policy should be to be effective?
Okay. Thank you, Matt, for that question. The move away from multilateralism, leadership on that front, to strongman nationalism. What do the panel think about this? And please, your question.
Hi, mine's actually not that different. I'm here from the Lee Kuan Yew School. One of the things I wonder about with the skepticism around this whole deal is if it succeeds, does it say something worrying about the way in which international diplomacy is changing? You know, there are those of us who actually, as much as we'd like to see peace in the Korean Peninsula, I'm not sure I want to see President Trump succeed in altering the norms of international diplomacy and cooperation. So I just welcome your comments on that.
Okay. Thanks for those three interesting sets of questions. They're actually interrelated, as it were, because it's all about what the broad implications are of the kinds of changes that we're seeing now. Is there a grand bargain? Is there a change in norms in which the way international diplomacy works? So perhaps I could begin from the other end now and coming back to John. Drew, you first.
Sure. Obviously, there's a lot to bite into there. I'm not a fan of the grand bargain solution because I think it's too difficult to bound. And again, it gets back to my theory about how you value different things. I mean, Kissinger, accomplished great things, but often at the cost of other countries' interests. I think that would, perhaps you could couch it another way. If the U.S. and China were to sit down together and figure out how to divide up Asia into spheres of influence or trade space, and how would the rest of Asia feel about that? And I think it would be soundly rejected. So I think a grand bargain with China is difficult. One of my former bosses, when we would be trying to dissect a very complex, intractable problem, he would challenge us to separate the variables. Of course, what does that mean? But essentially, the other saying is, if you're trying to eat an elephant, how do you go about it? One bite at a time is the answer. So you have to kind of look at these in some degree of isolation. There are certain norms that the U.S. wants to, ensure or continued and promulgated, and whether that's freedom of navigation, whether that's maritime space, trade, space, international security. But there's other things that clearly the Trump administration and China and other leaders want to see reforms, and they want to see changes. And I don't think you could trade WTO reforms or UN Security Council reforms and realignment with an intractable national security problem either. So I think the trades are very, very difficult.
Thank you, Drew. Qingmin.
First, I think today, if we could find a solution or engage in the Kishorian style of grand bargain, but we may be able to find out solutions for many of the problems we are facing. But unfortunately, we are in a time when globalization goes, there is anti-globalization, and then also the rise of nationalism of each of the leaders, tend to domestic politics. I don't think today the leaders, even the powerful leaders, they will, put international, policy as the priority of the consideration. Each of them are domestic, inward-looking. So in this regard, I do not see that it is possible. But I think, if we look at the, from a diplomatic perspective, many of the multilateral issues need to be negotiated, settled through bilateral means. Without a bilateral cooperation, multilateral, diplomacy could not succeed. In this regard, I think it needs, the big powers, the major countries in the world, they could have a good bilateral relation in order to seek the goal of a grand bargain settlement for the problem we are facing.
Thank you, Qingmin. Jong-un.
As you may agree, I think I said this last year's session too. China sees North Korean issue through the lens of US-China, China-US strategic competition, which means North Korean nuclear issue is not to be isolated from the rest of the other regional issues such as Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea issues, even trade issues. So I think China might aspire to achieve, as Peter pointed out, some sort of a grand bargain. Okay, not just deal with the North Korean issue per se. They probably want to link it to other issues, to draw concessions from the United States. That was what China was thinking, but recently I think China has realized that is too ambitious. I think that they have shifted their strategy. Rather than pursuing such a grand bargain, they are pursuing kind of a mini grand bargain, which means trading North Korean denuclearization with the change in U.S. alliance structure in Northeast Asia. That is what we have understood as a Kissingerian approach toward the North Korean nuclear issue. If you read the Wall Street op-ed by Kissinger last year, he was hinting at kind of an exchange between North Korean nukes with the future bargain about a U.S. strategy on the Korean Peninsula. That is exactly what Kim Jong-un is pursuing. Trading apparent, complete, but partial denuclearization with the dissolution or drastic reduction of US military forces in Korea or hopefully in Japan. If that kind of a scenario is unfolded, China believes it is quite beneficial to everybody. And nationalistic leaders prefer bilateral diplomacy than multilateral diplomacy. If we are able to resolve this issue with this kind of very imaginative kind of the approaches, then we can move on to kind of a new world in which multilateralism will be prevailing over bilateralism, and that will be, influencing the Trump's thinking about the world order. John will be dealing with it.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll fix it.
Yeah.
Kiichi.
A grand bargain is difficult when we face power transition, when the distribution of power is changing dramatically, like rise of China, and that enhances anxiety over possible scenarios, which makes it difficult to work on trade. So that's one reason why I'm skeptical about a bargain argument, such as what Hugh White, US, and China, and I hope it will happen, but I doubt if it will happen. And also we face this area of what I have called deglobalization, or reaction against the trend of globalization, coming back to nation states, coming back to the narrative of nation states, which brings us back to, well, sort of a balance of power politics in international relations. Having said that, balance of power does not really kick out possibility of institutions or agreement. Just take a look at Congress of Vienna. There could be a common future that all nations may want to avoid. If there is a common shared assumption about worst-case scenarios, that could bring the powers to a certain agreement, however fragile it may be. And on this sense, I would say that China doesn't want a war with the United States. And the United States is not really willing to be engaged in a long war. This is very weak, but nonetheless, and this is the basic of an idea of common security, not based on a multinational or civil society-based common security, but nonetheless could be at least sufficient to support the status quo, even when power transition challenges that. So that's a limited but important step that we might want to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiichi. Now, John, I know you'll want to speak to the grand bargain issue, but you're also my hope for finding the kernel of multilateral optimism that we can share with the audience, as you've done, as you do here, as you've done in all your writings. So inspire us.
10 years ago, we began these meetings. We were all younger. And, we did start with a view of multilateralism. This was at the very beginning of what would become the Obama administration, 8 years, and Anne-Marie Slaughter and I had written this little book, Forging a World of Liberty Under Law. And it was really making the case for multilateralism regionally and globally. And one of the proposals we had was for an East Asian security mechanism. And so we started thinking, and indeed our very first years were focused on institution building. Are there imagined institutional creations that could reinforce and facilitate regional security cooperation that aren't there? Looking at other parts of the world, certainly Europe, there isn't that kind of infrastructure for arms control, security cooperation, dialogue, crisis diplomacy mechanisms. And there was the six-party talks, which had a basket. Tom was a basket 3 or basket 4, and the idea was that it wasn't simply going to be a negotiation about North Korea. It was going to be North Korea was going to be, in some sense, not so much the reason we're meeting, but a kind of catalyst for building a larger regional Northeast Asia, perhaps even more than Northeast Asia, multilateral security community that would thereby create both pressure on North Korea and a sense of what a North Korea relationship with the outside world could really look like on the other side of denuclearization. And all that got lost. And now we have these two leaders in a kind of reality television relationship, and we've forgotten the larger regional context. And so my message would be, there have been 4 components to a strategy for dealing with North Korea as a rising security threat. They are containment. North Korea, we forget this, but they generate illicit drugs that they traffic in for hard currency. They engage in counterfeiting. They sell technology. They're basically a pretty bad country. And of course, they abuse their own people. And Kim Jong-un is not just a buffoonish, slightly overweight, misunderstood proto-world statesman who has an 80% approval rating in South Korea. And President Moon inviting him to South Korea is going to make Kim Jong-un even more of a friendly character, misunderstood. How could the United States treat him so poorly when in fact he's one of the great tyrants of the world? And the containment means not in the narrow Cold War sense, but in the sense that containing North Korea's incentives to traffic in all these other illicit activities. Deterrence. As North Korea builds up its capabilities, they must learn what every other nuclear power has learned. It's not easy being a nuclear power. Other countries are worried about you. They're going to be wondering about your security institutions and so forth. So we are going to make it clear to you that those weapons are putting you in a position where you're going to have discipline. Otherwise, you're going to blow yourself up. And then sanctions. I think you really do have to have sanctions. Now, I'm a sanctions man coming from the political left. So I'm an internationalist. I actually do believe in the United Nations. And since I spent a lot of time at Oxford this year at All Souls reading about sanctions and internationalism and multilateralism in the 19th century.
The 19th century.
So I could spend hours talking to you about arbitration agreements in the 1860s. But the sanctions regime, the idea of sanctions came out of the peace movement after the Napoleonic Wars as a mechanism for finding ways to put pressure on states short of war. So sanctions are a peace movement tool brought to international politics. So when we talk about sanctioning North Korea, it's not a realist strategy of trying to collapse North Korea and put them under pressure in that sense, but it's to manifest the international community's view that what they are doing is wrong and it's unacceptable, and we aren't going to have normal relationships unless you change. And so I think that's very important that sanctions be understood in those terms. And then finally, the fourth component is diplomacy. There is an off-ramp that North Korea should know that there is a better world out there. It's the oldest part of the strategy that goes back to the 1990s for sure, which is we will make your life better if you make our life better. If you start to move to disassemble these weapons and programs, we will start to normalize. And you will be better, and certainly your people will be better. And so those four components can't go away, but they all require us to think about a world where it's North Korea, I have to say this, against everybody else. If it's the international community that's saying there have been 26 UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea, there is an international view that that those weapons are illegal and unacceptable, and that is not somehow the U.S. and North Korea have got to find a way to live together. No, it's North Korea has to find a way to respond to the international community's view that we are not going to step back from insisting upon your change in behavior. And that means multilateralism. It means that China has a stake in this, we have a stake in this, Japan has a stake in this, and that for all the other countries, certainly China, that what makes this attractive, this framing, is that it puts, you know, this basket 3 of the six-party talks, of a regional security mechanism where China can address what it worries about in terms of the United States, and what the United States worries in terms of China, because China is spending 12%, growing its defense budget 12% a year, so it's a revisionist state in the region militarily. So it has to expect responses and security dilemma dynamics, and that is something that can be brought into this multilateralism. So that's my best shot.
Thank you, John, for that very stirring vision. Now, I would love for this to continue, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time. Those of you who are conference participants, we need to do something after this, so if you could gather around either Willip or Andrea or myself. Those in the audience, I want to thank you all for your attention and for your energy and enthusiasm and your questions. It has made for a very wonderful morning. And then finally, you know, we've reached the end of this panel discussion. I think you will agree with me. It has been, whether you agree or disagree with different specific positions that have been put down, the quality of thought, the eloquence with which the views have been presented, it has been a genuine privilege to get to be part of this conversation with this distinguished panel. So I invite you to thank them most warmly for an amazing morning.